CEO Daddy. Chapter 1311. Accepted Reality. John Wilson was still savage, thinking of perishing together, when he suddenly heard a gunshot. He staggered, and with great difficulty, he looked down at the blood that was flowing from his leg, and painfully but unwillingly knelt down. His scarlet eyes slowly raised, and he saw a gun in Dempsey Wilson's hands, staring at him viciously. "Do you want to die? I will help you." Dempsey Wilson walked towards him step by step, his fingers tightly grasping the gun. "Young master." Larry was so scared that his face changed. He quickly took a step forward with the intention to stop Dempsey Wilson. "Kill me, Dempsey Wilson. Don't you have guts? Do you dare to kill?" "You don't dare." "I dare to." "Indeed. I killed your father, so you should kill me yourself now to avenge him." His men did not come to save him after a long time. His mind was also blown up. He felt a deep sense of fear. He believed that Dempsey Wilson would not come here without preparation, and now, it seemed that the killer that he invited had long been taken care of. "Young master, please calm down. He is trying to provoke you to commit a crime." Larry was also half dead from fright. If the gun in Dempsey Wilson's hand really was fired, and John Wilson really died in his hands, then wouldn't young master be committing murder? John Wilson did want to anger Dempsey Wilson to kill himself. At this moment, he really wanted to die. Dempsey Wilson aimed the gun at his injured leg and shot another shot. John Wilson let out a miserable scream that was unbearable. The blood flowed even faster, and his face immediately became pale. "Won't you kill me? Your father will definitely be very disappointed." His son actually did not avenge him. John Wilson was in so much pain that the veins on his forehead popped, but he still did not give up on trying to provoke Dempsey Wilson. Dempsey Wilson threw the handgun on the ground, turned around and carried the old man who had just swallowed his last breath. Right at this moment, a group of men in plain clothes rushed up to him. "Dempsey Wilson, why didn't you kill me?" John Wilson roared in anger, his face full of despair. It was as if Dempsey Wilson did not hear him. It was only natural that Dempsey Wilson would not kill him, for he wanted him to live in hell. Dempsey Wilson carried his grandfather onto the carriage, his fingers trembling with a look of sorrow on his face. He wanted to pull the knife out from his grandfather's heart, but he didn't dare touch it even though he tried to stretch his hand out a few times. Tears rolled down in a direction that no one could see. As the car drove along the road towards the Wilson family manor, Dempsey Wilson leaned on the back of his seat dumbly. Beside him was his most respected grandfather. He looked out the window. This long journey made him feel pain and trepidation. He even forgot to wipe the tears at the corner of his eyes. Just like that, he looked out of the window absent-mindedly. How was he going to explain all this to his grandmother? He had thought that he had the courage to face everything, but now he realized that all of it had been given to him by his grandfather. His grandfather's death seemed to have taken away the courage in his heart, leaving him completely helpless. John Wilson deserved to die. He deserved to die. Dempsey Wilson wanted to use a blade to hack him into 1,000 pieces. Dempsey Wilson then acted as if he had just awoken from a dream. He reached for a tissue at the side and quickly wiped the tears in his eyes. This journey was the most painful and perplexed path he had walked in his life, and in the future, he would remember his grandfather's teachings. The car stopped at the main entrance, causing Dempsey Wilson to take a deep breath. Suddenly, he saw the old lady and Lorena holding onto the two children, quickly walking out of the hall. Dempsey Wilson's heart trembled. He quickly opened the car door and got down. Afterwards, he directly walked in front of them and whispered to his mother, "Mom, bring Emma and Frank upstairs. I have something to say to Grandma." "Don't say anything first. Your grandpa went out early in the morning. No one answered my call. I'm very worried about him. Come with me to find John. He was the one who invited your grandpa out for lunch." The old lady spoke as she pulled Dempsey Wilson's arm, thinking to get in his car to go out. "Grandma, Grandpa, Grandfather is back." Dempsey Wilson's voice was choked with sobs. He was still unable to pretend to be strong. The pain in his heart had reached the extreme. Lorena looked at her son's reddened eyes and was shocked. She hurriedly lowered her head and said to the two little fellows, "Let's go. Go upstairs with Grandma to play. Daddy has important things to do." The two kids were sensible and could tell that their father was depressed today. They obediently nodded their heads and followed their grandmother upstairs. At the top of the stairs, Claire ran down while wearing a thick jacket. "Your father is back." "Yes, Daddy seems to be very sad," Emma said as she blinked her eyes. Claire was startled. She reached out to stroke her head and quickly went outside. Dempsey Wilson's heart trembled as he quickly walked in front of the old lady, and said with a sorrowful expression, "Grandmother, I have something to tell you. The reason John Wilson invited Grandfather out today is not to accompany him for a meal. He only wanted to find a chance to kidnap Grandfather to threaten me." "What did you say?" When the old lady heard his words, her face was filled with astonishment. Dempsey Wilson felt that he had to explain everything to Grandma. Otherwise, how sad would Grandma be when she saw that Grandfather had already gone? Dempsey Wilson took out his phone and showed the video he saved for the old lady. The old lady's finger trembled, but she still watched the video that John Wilson just sent. She was stunned, and after a long while she raised her head and looked at Dempsey Wilson. "Is this true?" "Grandmother, I'm sorry, I didn't rescue Grandpa safely." Dempsey Wilson lowered his head, blaming himself again. When Claire just walked out of the door, she heard the conversation between Dempsey Wilson and the old lady. She was so shocked that she had to cover her mouth with her hands, and her breathing stopped as well. The old lady's body trembled, and almost fell to the ground, as Dempsey Wilson supported her in time. "How did your grandfather die?" The old lady seemed to have guessed what would happen. Grief filled her eyes and her voice trembled. "Grandpa died on his own," Dempsey Wilson answered painfully. The old lady steadied herself and opened the car door to see the old man sitting there with a serene expression. However, there was a knife stuck in his chest, and blood stained his suit. When the old lady saw this, she immediately fainted. "Grandmother," Dempsey Wilson called out to her sorrowfully as he walked over quickly. Upon seeing the old man, his eyes also instantly became sour. Just then, a sports car drove in from outside, with an emergency brake behind his car. Joshua Wilson ran over with a worried look. "What happened to Grandma?" Just as Joshua Wilson asked that, he saw his grandfather who was sitting inside the car. After clearly seeing his grandfather's condition, Joshua Wilson's voice seemed to be suddenly blocked, and he was unable to voice it out again. His entire body felt like it had been frozen, and was numb for a long time. The old lady woke up. 2 hours later, Dempsey Wilson and Joshua Wilson had already settled down the old man. The entire Wilson family was shrouded in a layer of deep sadness. Dempsey Wilson sat on the side of her bed, and told the old lady everything that had happened today. The old lady leaned on her pillow, and after she finished listening sadly, she reached out her hands to wipe her tears. Why is he still unrepentant? Previously, I didn't believe it, but now, I believe it. This evil son is responsible for his own crimes. I'll go kill him now, bastard. Joshua Wilson was so angry that his face turned green. He stood up and was about to walk out. Come back, the old lady shouted in a low voice. Joshua Wilson froze in place. Grandmother, we can't let Grandpa just die like this, Joshua Wilson said angrily. Your grandfather chose to die because he did not want to see his family kill each other. Don't you understand? If you kill him, you won't be able to change that fact. Even though the old lady was extremely saddened, she was not delirious. She had lived to such an age, and had endured what she shouldn't have. She had experienced what she shouldn't have. Father's death was also caused by him. Now that he forced grandfather to his death, the one who deserves to die has always been him. The hatred in Joshua Wilson's heart could not be dissipated. He truly wanted to kill John Wilson to vent his hatred. Dempsey, it's up to you to support this family now. You decide, the old lady said sorrowfully. Dempsey Wilson nodded his head. Grandmother, rest assured, I will make him atone for his sins. Chapter 1312. The most terrible thing was hopeless. When he woke up, he was already locked in a dark room. The wound on his leg had been simply bandaged, and without the help of anesthetic, someone was sewing his wound, causing him to wake up in pain. Seeing the wounds that were beyond recognition, he fainted once again from the pain. After repeating this a few times, he only felt the urge to die. He knew that if he did not have the courage to seek death, Dempsey Wilson would not let him die so easily. Only by living could he have thousands of ways to torture him. He, who was almost 50 years old, suffered for his entire life, but in the end, he ended up like this. This was all his own fault. He didn't have the face to beg for forgiveness anymore. The tightly shut door opened and an ice-cold voice came out. John Wilson, come out. Someone wants to see you. John Wilson immediately forced himself to stand up. He thought that the old president would come and save him, but when he walked out and saw that person, his hopes fell on nothing once again. The reason why the old president did not send anyone to kill him was because John Wilson did not know many secrets, but he believed that the president would not let him off that easily. Jack Wilson sat on the chair, looking at him with a sorrowful gaze, as if he was looking at a stranger. Jack, why are you here? John Wilson did not dare meet his son's eyes. He was afraid. Jack Wilson gritted his teeth and endured for a long time before asking, did you force grandfather to death? Is this what you want? Are you satisfied now? Jack, even you want to mock me? I'm your father. Grandfather is also your father. You can force him to his death, and I can also learn from you. Do you think that you still have the qualifications to continue to be my father? I am ashamed of you. Jack Wilson fiercely smashed his fist on the table, so much so that the veins on his forehead were popping. John Wilson looked at his son's eyes that were filled with anger and resentment. Jack, I didn't know that you had such deep feelings for your grandfather. I thought. So why? Do you think I'm as cold-blooded and heartless as you? You have no idea that after you were captured 5 years ago, Your grandparents could have returned to live in peace, but the two elders stayed abroad to live with me. What they did for me, a cold-blooded person like you, had no idea at all. Grandparents never gave up on you. You are the one who gave up." Jack Wilson's eyes turned red, and tears rolled in his eyes. He painfully growled. He could not accept this kind of outcome. He would rather his grandfather be defeated by an illness than see him die because of his own father. This kind of pain was not something he could accept. John Wilson listened to his son's accusation, and saw the condemnation and disappointment in his eyes. He was completely stupefied. "I don't want to harm your grandfather. I only wanted to use him to threaten Dempsey Wilson to give me the shares. It's him. He would rather die than let Dempsey Wilson give his share to me." What does this mean? This proves that in his eyes, I am still inferior to Dempsey Wilson. John Wilson still wanted to explain something, but realized that no matter how he tried to explain it, he couldn't prove it for himself. "Then go to hell." Jack Wilson stood up, his gaze not carrying even the slightest of kinship, and only coldly said those words, before turning around and leaving. Jack, stop. Listen to me. Be careful. I'm worried that they will harm you." John Wilson ignored his son's curse and started shouting behind his back. "They? Who is it? Dempsey Wilson? Or the old dog you were loyal to? They just have to come. The son will pay the debt of his father, and I am ready to shoulder the consequences for you." Jack Wilson stopped his steps, and coldly laughed at himself. "I'm sorry, son." John Wilson's body trembled. Suddenly, he was speechless. Jack Wilson left immediately. His heart had long ago become numb, and he did not even give a second glance. John Wilson suddenly calmed down. He sat on the chair, looked at the guard and asked, "Do you have a cigarette? Can you give me one?" That man didn't show any signs of being loyal. He only stared expressionlessly at the wall in front of him. John Wilson laughed self-deprecatingly. His current miserable life had made him extremely disrespectful. He suddenly felt that there was no meaning in living anymore. His son must be desperate for him, too. At night, John Wilson trembled from the cold. Suddenly, he heard the door being opened by a man. His face could not be seen clearly, but his voice was cold and merciless. "John Wilson, sir wants me to bring you a few words. If you want your son to be safe and sound, you better shout your mouth up. Will Mr. President save me?" John Wilson carried his last hope and asked. "The president said that only the dead can do good. Either you live to be a mute, or you die. The choice is yours." After saying that, the man turned and left. John Wilson knew that the president was an old cunning fox and he wouldn't waste time saving an abandoned child. The reason why John Wilson didn't want to die was because he was still waiting for someone who he wanted to see the most. Unfortunately, after being locked up for 3 days, the person he had been waiting for still had not appeared. He couldn't help but ask the guard at the side, "Can you help me tell Dempsey Wilson that I need to see my mother one last time? I have something to say to her, please." The guard remained expressionless, like two statues. John Wilson raised his head to look at the sky. He did not believe that his mother would be so heartless, to the point where she was unwilling to even meet him. Finally, the two brothers Dempsey Wilson and Joshua Wilson arrived. The moment Joshua Wilson entered, he wanted to step forward and beat him up, but was stopped by Dempsey Wilson. "Don't dirty your hands." Joshua Wilson glared at John Wilson angrily, not even wanting to speak a word with him. John Wilson knew that he had committed a huge mistake and that he wouldn't be able to take revenge even if he were to die for it. Has my dad's funeral done? I want to kowtow to him, John Wilson said. Grandpa would not want to see you. Dempsey Wilson looked disdainfully at him, staring coldly as if he was looking at a dead object. What about my mother? Doesn't she want to come and see me? I know I won't be able to live much longer. Let me see her one last time, John Wilson pleaded again. His expression was sorrowful. Grandma said that she doesn't have a son like you. She never wants to see you again, Dempsey Wilson said coldly as before. Impossible. My mom doted on me the most since I was young. It's impossible for her not to come see me. John Wilson's mood finally crumbled as he screamed in pain. You told her not to come. It must be. Seeing John Wilson's crazy appearance, Joshua Wilson laughed coldly and ridiculed. Grandmother has already been disappointed to the extreme by you. She will never want to see you again in her entire life. You're lying. The last straw in John Wilson's hand was easily snapped by the Wilson brothers. His breathing instantly became painful and uncomfortable, both of his hands tightly pressed on the painful head. Actually, in the 3 days that he had been locked up, a large portion of his hair had already turned white. You are the president's right-hand man. Do you have anything you want to say? Dempsey Wilson coldly asked him. Will you let me go if I tell you? John Wilson raised his head, his gaze carrying ridicule. Let's see if the information you provided is valuable. If it's worth your life. Dempsey Wilson's gaze turned as cold as lightning. Dempsey Wilson, did Joseph Grant give you a huge benefit? Tell me, what is it? John Wilson laughed crazily. A greedy person like you will never understand. Dempsey Wilson knew that it was impossible for John Wilson to say it, because he still had a son. For his son, he would definitely clench his teeth until the end. Is it your indestructible friendship? John Wilson asked sarcastically. Dempsey Wilson swept a cold gaze across his face. If you don't want to become the burden of your son, then settle down. In this life, don't think you can never leave this place. With those cold words, there was no hope at all. John Wilson looked at the walls, which were as solid as an iron cage, locking him up here for the rest of his life. I hope that in my next life, I won't run into any of you family members again, and that we won't be family. John Wilson swore a poison oath. That won't happen, because a wicked person like you has no next life. Dempsey Wilson's words were even more bone-piercing, causing John Wilson's entire body to freeze, and his expression to turn ashen. Joshua Wilson also added on, you will go to hell. Chapter 1313, Kind-Hearted Help. It was almost the end of the year, and all the year-end inventory was done at this time. Even the archive was not an exception. The alternation of old and new documents. As she was a new person, learning how to file and organizing documents at the same time almost made her faint with all the numbers. Fortunately, in her bones, Alvina Miller had a personality that refused to admit defeat. Even if she had to work overtime, she would have to finish all the work she had done today. Around 9 p.m. in the evening, the lights in the office were still on. All the departments were busy with their work at the end of the year. Alvina Miller did not have the time to eat in the afternoon, so when she was working overtime, she obviously did not have enough stamina to continue working. Alvina suddenly, she heard someone calling her name and immediately came out of a row of cabinets. She thought that he was an office colleague, but who knew that the moment she came out, it turned out to be Benson. Ever since the last time they bumped into each other and messed up the documents, Benson would occasionally pass by and greet her, with the mindset of having one more friend and one less enemy. Whenever Alvina Miller greeted him, she would normally wave or nod at him politely. "Alvina, did you eat tonight?" Benson placed an exquisite bag on the table. "I bought a box of bread for my female colleagues in the office. She actually left work now. I am a man. I never eat sweet food. I was just thinking if you want to eat it or not. It would be a pity to throw it away." Bread? As Alvina Miller's stomach rumbled from hunger, as she suddenly heard of sweet and soft bread, she subconsciously gulped down her saliva, finding it hard to resist the temptation of the delicious food. "Yeah, this was bought from a famous bakery outside our office. I heard many girls like it. Do you want to have it?" Benson acted like he was really troubled, pretending that he didn't want to give her food on purpose, but that he bought an extra set, and didn't want to throw it away. "Benson, how about you give it to the other female colleagues in your office to eat? I ate in the afternoon." Although Alvina Miller continuously gulped down her saliva, she still insisted on not accepting anything from the man, even if it was just a few pieces of bread. "Alvina, don't misunderstand. I didn't mean to give it to you to eat. My female colleagues in the office left work early. I also asked around and came over before I could send them out," Benson quickly explained with an embarrassed look. Seeing his expression, Alvina Miller felt that he probably came to find her out of goodwill because he really didn't want to waste this food. "How much is it?" "I'll give you the money." Alvina Miller hurriedly took her bag. "Alvina, we work in the executive office together. Aren't you being a little too formal with me like this? How can you pay me? Then what about my reputation as a man? Although my family isn't that wealthy, I can still give away a few pieces of bread." Benson immediately had a face full of shock. Alvina Miller also felt that it was a little strange. She could only laugh dryly. "Then thank you. I am really hungry. Then I'll leave it here." After Benson finished speaking, he immediately left. Alvina Miller's beautiful eyes peeked at his disappearing figure. In the next second, she quickly grabbed the wrapping bag and opened it. Smelling the fragrant and sweet bread, she quickly walked to the side of the tea house and decided to enjoy it. Just as Alvina Miller was hiding inside, eating bread, her phone suddenly rang. She quickly took it out and saw that it was the Lieutenant Hilton's number. Her beautiful eyes lit up as she quickly answered it. "Hey, Lieutenant Hilton." As Alvina Miller spoke, she was also unwilling to put down the bread. "What are you eating?" The man's deep, magnetic voice was heard with a touch of tenderness. When Alvina Miller heard this familiar man's voice, she was so scared that she almost choked. A mouthful of bread was stuck in her throat, and she immediately started coughing violently. Joseph Grant's voice was instantly tainted with dissatisfaction. "Why can't it be me? Do you really want to talk to my lieutenant?" "No, no, no, I was just surprised. Of course I hope it's you." Alvina Miller felt that there was something wrong with his tone, and immediately explained with a strong desire for survival. From the other side came the low and resounding laughter of a man. Hearing it, it sounded as though she was about to become pregnant. Alvina Miller blushed a little at his smile. She had already forgotten about the bread in her hands, and asked softly, "Is it that funny? It's already so late, and you're still eating?" Did you not have dinner? The man stopped laughing, his voice full of concern. Yeah, I haven't eaten much. I'll be very busy the next few days. I'm still working overtime. Alvina Miller answered pitifully. I'm still in the office. What time do you get off work? The man asked softly. It might be over 10, and you? Alvina Miller guessed and answered. Then I'll be back earlier than you. I want to go back, so come back earlier as well. The man's voice suddenly became low and hoarse. That feeling of yearning was mixed in with his voice, making those who heard it feel moved. Really as expected, Alvina Miller smiled happily. All right, I'll be going back now. I'll wait for you at home. The man deliberately dragged his voice very slow. All right, I'll see if I can return early. Alvina Miller wished that she could fly back home right now and not wait any longer. Don't worry, be careful. After the man finished, he hung up. Alvina Miller put down his phone, her eyebrows filled with a happy smile. She lowered his head and looked at the bread that he had beaten into a mess. Suddenly she did not want to eat any more, and felt a little embarrassed to eat more. There was always a feeling of betraying Joseph Grant, and she even caught the current guilt. Forget it. Let him cook when I get home. Alvina Miller put down the bread and found a reason for herself to be hungry. As expected, Alvina Miller was busy to the point where she could finally finish today's mission. In the middle of winter, she was sweating profusely. When she packed up her personal belongings and was about to leave, she suddenly saw a person squatting in front of a car. When she walked to the side of the car, that man seemed to be bent over trying to do something. Alvina Miller frowned, but still walked over with good intentions. She saw Benson sweating profusely as he changed the tires. Benson, why is it you? If it was someone that she didn't know, Alvina Miller would have definitely left immediately. But now, seeing that it was actually Benson who had just given her bread to eat, she couldn't help but greet him. Benson immediately laughed awkwardly. The tires on my car broke. It was hard for me to get a spare tire, but I never expected that my spare tire would actually be damaged. I am really unlucky. Alvina Miller looked at the large parking lot and saw a few cars scattered around. She couldn't help but ask, you can wait for your colleagues to leave together, but you'll have to send people over tomorrow to repair the tire. The people from my office are almost back. I don't know the people from other departments either. Benson shrugged his shoulders helplessly with an expression of defeat. Alvina Miller bit her lips. She really wasn't a person who liked to meddle in other people's business. But when she saw the man's tormented expression, she really sympathized with him. Where do you live? I'll see if it's all right. How about I give you a ride? It's going to snow again at this late hour. Alvina Miller raised her head and saw white snowflakes drifting down from the sky under the street light. Moreover, a lot of snow had also fallen on Benson's face and hair. Alvina, there's no need. You should leave first. It's already so late. You must also go back and rest. Don't worry about me. Benson looked like he did not want to trouble her. Alvina Miller sighed. No matter what, I ate your bread, so I'll just treat it as repaying you. Get on the car quickly. I'll give you a ride. Alvina, you're such a good person. Benson then stood up shyly and looked at her gratefully. Alvina Miller shrugged her shoulders. You praise me too much. I'm just an ordinary person. In the end, Benson got into Alvina Miller's small sports car. Compared to his $200,000 car, this exquisite and beautiful sports car was still very eye-catching. After Benson sat in the carriage, he became anxious and rushed. but he did not open his mouth to ask around. Instead, he just sat there obediently and pointed towards the direction Alvina Miller was heading back to. Alvina Miller also did not interact much with him. After all, she was not very familiar with him. Chapter 1314, The Promise of Life. The atmosphere inside the car was still awkward. The two of them weren't familiar with each other, and they had no common topics to talk about. The only thing they could talk about was which way to go. But Alvina Miller still felt that Benson was a very polite man, and very tactful. That was why she was willing to help him. Stop the car at the entrance of the residential complex. I'm home. Benson pointed to a street lamp in front, telling Alvina Miller to stop the car. Alvina, thank you for the ride. Be careful while driving. After Benson finished speaking, he pushed open the door and went down. Alvina Miller turned the car around, stepping on the throttle to the ground. She had a feeling that she was about to return home as soon as possible. Benson's residence was not on the same road as hers. She had went around it for more than half an hour. At the moment, it was already 11 o'clock. Alvina Miller's mood had become more anxious. She drove her sports car like lightning all the way home. When she stopped at the door, she felt dizzy and exhausted. As soon as she got out of the car, she heard a whisper of reproach. Why did you come home so late from work? When Alvina Miller raised her beautiful eyes, she saw the man actually sitting on the rocking chair beside the door. Fortunately, he was wearing a khaki-colored coat today. Otherwise, even Alvina Miller would not have been able to discover his existence. It's so cold. Why aren't you sitting in the living room? Alvina Miller's spirits lifted. All her tiredness had disappeared after seeing the man. She quickly ran forward 2 steps and stood in front of him. Seeing that the man had straightened his clothes and stood up, his tall body immediately enveloping the light above her head, she blinked her beautiful eyes, and in the next second, the man ruthlessly tugged at her wrist, walking towards the living room. Alvina Miller's mind buzzed, without a word, and followed him into the living room. As soon as she stepped in, the man lightly pushed her against the wall to the side. Her back stuck to the wall, but a touch of a slightly cold man's body was right in front of her. His clothes were very cold, perhaps because he had been frozen outside. He was actually not as hot as before. For some reason, when Alvina Miller was hugged so tightly by him, her beautiful face fainted, but her lips formed a smile. She raised her head and stared straight at him. The living room only had a few lights on. The lights were dim, but her eyes were bright and smiling. Did you miss me? Alvina Miller boldly asked him directly, completely ignoring the girl's discretion. You should be punished if you ask despite knowing the answer. After the man finished speaking, he lifted up her small chin and his thin lips domineeringly occupied the sweet taste of her lips. Even though Alvina Miller was being kissed by him, she couldn't help but giggle. As the corner of her mouth was curled up, it was already a little impossible for a man to kiss her deeply. What's the good news? You're laughing so happily. The man's mood seemed to be infected by her and his voice was much gentler. His fingers gently caressed her lips as if he was infatuated with her, and he didn't want to leave. It's nothing. I just feel that our relationship is a little funny. Alvina Miller replied with a smile. How is that funny? The handsome face of the man was slightly startled before he inexplicably started to blame himself. Had this woman disliked him? Stealthily sneaking around. So exciting, Alvina Miller lifted the tip of her feet and breathed into his ear. As Joseph Grant listened, he felt a sense of guilt and apologized. Alvina, I'm sorry. I didn't let you be my girlfriend in broad daylight, and I still need you to keep you to me every day. Are you going to bother me? It can't be. I like the feeling of dating. Interesting. Alvina Miller heard him apologize and was immediately stunned. Immediately after, she tiptoed and took the initiative to kiss him on his lips. Joseph Grant, do you know? I don't feel wronged at all, because I know that you hold me in your heart and that you will miss me. Alvina, the man looked at her bright eyes as he muttered her name, as if he wanted to carve her name into his heart. Say it again, I like it. The girl's overbearing request was even more greedy than his. The man laughed at her interest. His laughter was as mellow as wine, intoxicating. Say it, and say you love me. Alvina Miller was very weird. Her mind was full of naughty ideas. At that moment, she felt like she was holding on to Joseph Grant. Whatever she wanted him to do, he would do it obediently. She felt a sense of accomplishment. It's too nauseating. The man had already understood her mischievous thoughts and could not help but laugh as he spoke. Mr. Vice President is so stingy with his love words. If you don't tell me, then you're going to tell someone else. Alvina Miller immediately frowned, with a questioning expression. No, I will tell you alone. In terms of love between a man and a woman, Joseph Grant was not Alvina Miller's match at all. Forget it. Don't say any more. I need to go upstairs and take a bath. Make way. Alvina Miller immediately showed an expression of indifference, extending her two small hands and forcefully pushing at his chest. However, the more she pushed him away, the tighter he stuck to her. He wouldn't let her go at all. Alvina, I love you. The man's handsome face flushed red as he shyly confessed to her. Alvina Miller was startled. She was just joking with him. Did he not see that? This man was really funny. In the future, she had plenty of ways to play tricks on him. I know. Alvina Miller was also shy, but the strange noise that followed made her beautiful face turn even redder. Your stomach is growling? Joseph Grant's sharp ears could hear the gurgling sounds coming from her stomach. Alvina Miller immediately pushed him away with strength that came from nowhere. You know I'm hungry, so why don't you hurry me up and make me something to eat? There's nothing to eat at home. It's so cold. You can't possibly eat cold food, right? The romance that filled Joseph Grant's mind was also instantly extinguished by this woman's stomach. As expected, 3 meals a day was the main point of the two of them getting along. Alvina Miller opened the refrigerator and placed one hand on her waist as she squinted her eyes to think about what to eat. Noodle. The man reached for a bundle of noodles and headed back to the kitchen. The Mr. Vice President is really considerate. Are you going to cook for me personally? Seeing that, Alvina Miller immediately laughed and joked. Otherwise, let you do it? I'm afraid you'll be hungry until midnight. The man had no confidence in her cooking skills. This is really a blow to me. Forget it. I'll give you a chance to show off. If the noodles you make are delicious, they'll be a surprise tonight. Alvina Miller immediately smiled and followed him into the kitchen. With her hands behind her back and leaning against the door, she said mysteriously, "Is that so? What surprise are you going to give me?" It's better not to be scary. The man couldn't help but laugh. His mood was extremely good. Even though the two of them had been working for the entire day and were very tired, as long as they were together, time would become very relaxed and gentle. Don't you have any expectations? Alvina Miller pouted. I'm looking forward to it, but can you tell me a little? I need to prepare myself. The man boiled the water in the pot and threw the noodles down to cook. At the same time, he had already started to take off his coat, and after taking it off, he gave it to Alvina Miller casually. I've decided on one thing. This matter can only be completed by the two of us. Alvina Miller intentionally smiled and said, What is it? Joseph Grant rolled over the noodles with the chopsticks, and looked at her with a pair of gloomy eyes. Guess. Alvina Miller blinked his eyes. Alvina, you aren't thinking of developing further with me, are you? The man's charming eyes shook and he directly asked. Alvina Miller immediately jumped 2 steps forward, right into his chest, raised her head and asked, May I? No way. Joseph Grant immediately rejected her offer. Alvina, this won't do, he added softly, as if he was afraid she wouldn't be able to bear the consequences. I knew you would be unhappy. Forget it. I don't want to scare you. Alvina Miller hugged his overcoat tighter, pouting her lips with an unhappy expression. Be more pure. The man came over and knocked her on the head. Aren't we pure? We've slept on the bed for 2 nights and nothing has happened. Alvina Miller immediately retorted loudly. However, Joseph Grant actually went close to her ear and whispered into it. Who said it didn't happen? Your hand. Alvina Miller hurriedly reached out and covered his lips. You're not allowed to say it. Chapter 1315. To be in your favor. The girl's fingers were stained with traces of a delicate fragrance. When she held onto the man's thin lips, his entire body shuddered, and his eyes instantly became unfathomably deep. Alvina Miller could feel the heat in the man's breath, and beneath her palm was his firm and sexy lips. Before the man reached his hands out to take her restless little hands, she was already too embarrassed to do so. She immediately wanted to retract her hand, but in the next second, she was forcefully pulled into the man's embrace by a large palm. The lips that she had touched on her palm earlier were now in her hair. The scorching heat also burned her soft ears. This kind of intimate feeling made people immediately think of how lovers were rubbing their ears, and the air around them seemed to suddenly become much heavier, causing Alvina Miller's entire body to heat up. Joseph Grant, do you want to see the noodles in the pot? Although she was reluctant to part with and enjoyed the feeling of being hugged tightly, Alvina Miller cared even more about her own delicacy. The man smiled lazily into her ear, then let her go and turned away to flip the noodles with his chopsticks. Alvina Miller could not stand his low laughter any longer. Her beautiful eyes stared at the man's unsuspecting profile. The more she looked, the more she was moved. Joseph Grant glanced at her, seeing her staring at him in a daze. He couldn't help but reach out and pinch her fair cheeks. The feeling was extremely good, like a puppy that was about to eat meat, which made people want to tease her. Alvina Miller puffed up her cheeks. Why was this man looking at her so strangely? It was as if she had become his plaything. Why don't you go take a bath? It's already so late. If you're full, you won't be able to immediately take a bath and hurt your stomach. When the man saw that she had nothing else to do, he could only gently look at her. All right, I'm going to take a bath. Alvina Miller nodded obediently, turned and walked out. She quickly took a hot bath upstairs. Her mind was blurry and she had the urge to immediately lie down on the bed and go to sleep. But when she thought of another man cooking noodles for her downstairs, she became spirited again. She put her hands in her pockets and walked down briskly. As soon as she walked into the dining room, she smelled a fragrant aroma which made her appetite rise. "Come over and eat." Joseph Grant was only wearing a suit. Undoing his 2 buttons at the collar, he looked a lot more casual, but he did not know that his clothes were extremely enchanting. Alvina Miller's heart was in turmoil, and there was always the thought of pushing him down, even though she was a woman. "What are you daydreaming about?" Joseph Grant was using a towel to wipe the water droplets on his hands, but seeing that she was being silly, he could not help but chuckle. Alvina Miller was clever, and realized that she had spent more and more time being a narcissist. "What did you put in there? It smells so good." Alvina Miller immediately sat down, her beautiful eyes looking up at him, and asked, "I put in some sauce and a few slices of beef," Joseph Grant said slowly. "Do you want to have some too?" It was not good for Alvina Miller to eat alone, so she asked him with a smile, "No, go ahead and eat. I'm going upstairs to take a bath." Joseph Grant rarely ate at night, because his self-discipline did not only manifest in his treatment of work and it also reflected on the management of his body. Alvina Miller nodded her head. "All right. I will come and find you after I finish eating." "Okay, slowly eat." The man smiled. Of course, Alvina Miller had to slowly process all of this man's cooking skills. Honestly speaking, she felt that she was inferior to a woman, but she really didn't know if Joseph Grant would feel that this kind of lazy woman was incurable. After Alvina Miller finished her midnight snack, she ate too much in one go and actually endured. Her brows furrowed, and for a moment, she didn't know how she should relieve it. She was wearing a wide robe as she walked up the stairs. Joseph Grant's room had lights on as she quietly poked her head into it. Joseph Grant had actually just taken a bath and walked out of the bathroom. Furthermore, it seemed like it was not hard for him to bear the cold, as he did not even wear a thick nightgown. Alvina Miller took a deep breath, feeling that she came at the right time. "Come in." The man had noticed her long ago, so he smiled as he spoke. Alvina Miller put both her hands behind her back and walked in with a dry smile. Her beautiful eyes were lowered, as if she didn't dare to look at him. "Is your wound all right? How can you take a bath now?" Alvina Miller asked with a smile. "It almost recovered," Joseph Grant replied softly. "That, there seem to be several wounds on your back. How did that happen?" Alvina Miller saw with her sharp eyes that under the bright light Joseph Grant's body still had a few wounds that had faded, causing her heart to tremble. Some were left behind during training, others were caused by others. Joseph Grant said casually, as if he did not care about the injuries on his body. "So you've suffered so many injuries. Does it hurt?" As Alvina Miller spoke, her fingers had already uncontrollably touched one of his wounds. The man's muscular body couldn't help but tremble. "It doesn't hurt anymore." Joseph Grant hurriedly put on the nightgown that was placed on the bed, wanting to prevent her from continuing to look at it. Alvina Miller retracted her finger, but discovered that her fingertip was still trembling. She knew that this man didn't want her to worry about him, so he hid the wounds on his body. "Why don't you dry your hair? It's easy for you to get sick." When Alvina Miller raised her head, she just realized that his clean hair was still dripping with water, and she was concerned about him instantly. Joseph Grant shook his head, and water splashed onto her face. Alvina Miller knew that he was doing it on purpose, and unhappily shouted, "What are you doing?" Only then did Joseph Grant take a towel and wipe off the water droplets on his short hair. His short hair was also in a mess, but even if he did not have a single style, under his full forehead, he still had that handsome carved face, sexy, young, and full of male wildness. Alvina Miller looked at him in slightly astonishment, as if she had realized for the first time that this man was still so young. In the past, when he was always dressed in a suit and shoes, with a well-groomed hairstyle and a calm temperament, people would mistake him for an old official. But the moment his short hair rested on his forehead, Alvina Miller felt that he was the same age as her. So hairstyle was really that important. It could actually turn a man's temperament into that of a boy's in an instant. This was the so-called importance of hairstyle. "Why are you staring at me like that?" Joseph Grant tied the belt on his robe and turned his head. Seeing this woman's fixed eyes, Joseph Grant felt a sense of haziness, making people want to drown in her and see what she was thinking. "Oh, it's nothing." Alvina Miller immediately became embarrassed, and felt that she had become infatuated again. Joseph Grant's thin lips lifted. He had already seen through her little thoughts so far. His tall and big body stepped in front of her, and he, who was wearing his bathrobe, seemed to be even more unrestrained. Alvina Miller stood in front of him, petite and enchanting, with no power to resist. "Alvina, your eyes tell me that you want to sleep on my bed." The man came down and whispered into her ear. His words immediately made Alvina Miller's whole body tremble. "Don't speak nonsense. I don't have such thoughts." Alvina Miller immediately turned around with her back facing him, preventing him from reading her mind. Really, the man deliberately dragged his voice. "Since sleeping is a waste, I shouldn't ask for punishment." Alvina Miller curled her lips. The sense of loss in her words couldn't be hidden. Joseph Grant was amused by her words. "You seem to be wronged." Alvina Miller trembled. Oh my God, how could she always forget that she was a woman? Don't all women want to hold on to discretion? "No, I feel like you have the bearing of a man." I was too anxious. Alvina Miller straightened her expression, and turned to look at him. "If you don't want to take responsibility, then just say it. Why do you tantalize me every day?" Joseph Grant. After Alvina Miller finished speaking, she immediately walked outside. However, before she could even take 2 steps, she was forcefully pulled back by the man. Her back was pressed against his chest, and she could still feel the warmth from his body. "Alvina, wait a little longer. I'm actually just as impatient as you are," Joseph Grant replied in a low voice beside her ear, somewhat embarrassed.